Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Isn't this a great day?
Indeed.
It's the day we have, so that makes it great,
Yeah.
right? I want to welcome everybody. I am Darian Davis, the chair of Africana Studies, and I'm here just to introduce very briefly my colleague, Professor Wendell Marsh, and to welcome you to this great event with Professor Constance Hilliard. But what I want to say is that if you feel good about being in this space, food, you heard the music, just keep Africana studies in the back of your mind as you go forward in your career at Rutgers. There are many other classes. There are minors and majors waiting for you to take. And so we welcome you. I know a couple of you, but please don't feel shy to come up and introduce yourself to me and say hello. I'd love to hear more about you and to have a dialogue with you. I would be remiss if I didn't say that we want to thank our sponsors, co-sponsors with Africana Studies, the Sociology and Anthropology Department, the Center for African Studies, American Studies, and am I missing anybody? And history, yes, and history, my other department, yes. So I present to you the organizer of this event, Professor Marsh.
Thank you for that warm welcome and the invitation to the space which we're sharing. I am very happy and honored to introduce to you Dr. Constance Hilliard. But even though it's my task to introduce, what I actually want to do is give an appreciation. Dr. Hilliard is a professor of history at the University of North Texas, but that barely captures her work or her life. So I actually first came into awareness of Dr. Hilliard from my own research, working on a colonial Muslim intellectual in Senegal, a colonial era Muslim intellectual in Senegal. And she was the only person to have translated anything written by him into English. She did that as a part of her dissertation, and that she finished in 1977. Her dissertation was known amongst a small group of specialists as being a really important study that never really circulated. And for a while, it was kind of almost a mythology. So who was this Dr. Constance Hilliard, this African-American woman working in Arabic in the 70s? And I even wrote about this study in my dissertation, and without knowing, who she was. And it wasn't until a few years ago I realized that she was still active and working. And so reached out to her, and since then gotten to know her a little bit. But what I think is really remarkable about Dr. Hilliard's career is that after starting out working in Arabic philology for doing African history, she had a very robust professional career in journalism and business in the Gulf, and traveled, all over Africa. And so she came back to academia later on in her professional life, and she made a number of key contributions, including one on pre-colonial African intellectual traditions, which I think really paralleled and mirrored debates in Black studies broadly understood, this interest in recovering African intellectual histories before the colonial encounter, before the slave trade. And, so that was a very important contribution. But she also eventually produced a book called Straightening the Bell Curve, which was on really thinking through race science and eugenics, and how stereotypes about Black masculinity really drove and continues to drive research, and kind of showing that science too is socially constructed in so many ways. But the book that she will be discussing with us today is Ancestral Genomics, African American Health in the Age of Precision Medicine. Before I turn it over, though, I do just want to express my hope that your next book will be a memoir. Because as we might hear maybe some stories or just your skill of storytelling is so great, and you've done such important work, and can't wait to hear more about it and to ask you questions about it. So I present to you all Dr. Constance Hilliard.
Thank you so much, Professor Marsh. That was very, very inspiring, and I really felt it deeply, and thank you again. Thank you, Professor Davis. And I'm just, I'm feeling such warm vibrations here. I'm so very, very grateful to be in the presence of all of you. And I look forward to maybe there being a few questions and so forth. I was especially interested in the fact that Professor Marsh, Professor Davis had brought together a very interdisciplinary group. And the work I do is profoundly interdisciplinary. And what I mean is simply the fact that when I think through the narrative of my own research, 15 years ago, I discovered a historical tool that could be used in genetic medicine. And in so doing, it was transcending a lot of domains. But the point was the extraordinary value that history can bring to answering fundamental, profound human questions. During that time, I refined and grew to love this historical tool because it was correcting misunderstandings that crop up in 21st century medicine. And what accounts for this problem is the fact that there is such a very, very poor network of communication that exists among different fields of knowledge. And the errors that I am referring to have had especially deleterious effects on African Americans, and particularly in terms of the medical sciences as they relate to African American health. Part of the reason is tied to the medical industry's complete lack of knowledge about non-Western history. And what I have essentially worked to do is show how fundamental history and our understanding of the ecological environments that various non-Western populations who are now Americans have that relate to medical issues and essentially that relate to health. Today, I will be introducing 3 interrelated topics. Firstly, I want to help you to see why there is a major crisis in 21st century medicine, specifically 21st century medicine because that is the medicine of genetics, the medicine of genomics, precision medicine, precision oncology, whereby we're not dealing with vast generalities about human beings. If we're going to solve a problem relating to cancer or a problem relating to any chronic disease, the answers are going to have to be very specific because the gene variants causing those problems are not only specific, but they are highly localized. And if we don't know anything about the local environments that different populations come from, we make very, very serious mistakes. So today, I would like to introduce this talk by first explaining the nature of a major crisis in medicine. I will then move on to introduce medical implications of this problem. I had turned the second part of it, Timbuktu and APOL1 kidney diseases, so that you will really fundamentally understand the connection between a disease that kills 11,000 African Americans every year and the history of Timbuktu and the misconceptions that even American medical researchers have that have made it impossible for them to make the necessary connections. And in conclusion, I just want to say a few words about tearing down disciplinary boundaries. So in terms of my own background, I am, of course, an evolutionary historian, an African evolutionary historian. I've gone through various permutations, but I've come to recognize the absolute fundamental importance of not just history, but just as we talk about precision medicine, we have to talk about precision history and precision anthropology and precision sociology. We have to not just vaguely understand different people who are from different countries. We have to know who they are and know what their food sources were and know the kind of landscape that they lived in, because the genetic adaptations that different populations have emanate from that kind of knowledge. And when we don't have that kind of knowledge, our medical industry wastes an incredible amount of money just following all kinds of guesstimates that do not necessarily lead anywhere. So there were two highly unanticipated and perhaps politically unsettling discoveries that came out of the Human Genome Project, and it was launched in 2003. Now, the first of these issues related to the fact that understanding the general functionality of 22,000 genes was not going to cure many diseases. It was curing a few, but not very many. Why? Because what was realized was that apart from the 22,000 genes, human beings have, when I say 22,000 genes, what I mean is that is the definition of our species. All humans have 22,000 genes. So if you're looking in some particular microscopic instrument and you're counting, if it has 44,000, that's not human. you know, the thing that really shocked me is grains of rice have 44,000. You know, it kind of made me feel bad, but in any case, what turned out to be the case was that, okay, 2003, 2 million had been identified, but by 2019, it was understood that there are at least 335 million gene variants in the human genome. Now, that was pretty darn shocking because what it means is that if we're looking for disease triggers, we're going to have to understand some of these 335 million. And what became very, very, very apparent was that it's one thing to have the microscopic technology to identify variants, but the hard part, which has been impossible almost within the scientific industry, is to figure out how they function, what they're doing, what is causing what. And the reason it's so hard is because you can't look at a gene and know what the food culture is in a particular environment, and therefore what kinds of variants are absolutely required in order for a specific population to be able to digest particular foods. In fact, we now understand what happened to the Neanderthals. What happened to them? Well, I'm still thinking about the fact that we killed them all off. I'm sure there's something to that too. But the reality was that their gene variant pool was too small to accommodate all of the variations within their ecological environment, because it's all about, you know, climatic conditions. It's all about food. It's all about particular pathogens in a particular environment, and it goes on and on and on. It's all about whether you're living at the top of the Himalayas or whether you're living at the bottom. And see, when you're thinking about these kinds of issues, you have to realize that this is not about race. It's about highly localized, specialized populations. And I first began to realize that when I was doing some work, and I noticed that there was research going on in China regarding a particular disease issue. And so for that particular disease, they had to stratify their population so that you create one genomic profile for the Northern Han Chinese and a different profile for the Southern Han Chinese and a completely different one for the Beijing Han Chinese. And when we're talking about diversity, that whole situation became completely confused because there are two kinds of diversity. There is the diversity that we wish for in our society that is sometimes becoming harder and harder to achieve, whereby we can all get along and have the same opportunities. But see, there's something else in this 335 million that is not even being talked about by the scientific community. And that is the fact of where these 335 million genes are, because that is our pan-human genome. And it so happens that the pan-human genome is still on the African continent. It's still on the African continent. Now, let me also clarify just to some degree, this issue of race, because there have been so many misunderstandings, and the misunderstandings oftentimes ended up becoming debates relating to, oh, racialized medicine, that's racist, so we should therefore be colorblind. But the problem with colorblindness in medicine is that there are two problems. One problem is simply the fact that it uses the Northern European genome, which is very specific. It's one population out of thousands, the Northern European genome, and applies it to everybody. And so therefore, who gets healed from that kind of medical research? Lo and behold, it's only Northern Europeans. Okay. And so that kind of colorblindness doesn't work. But see, in truth, racialized medicine, in terms of putting people in racial categories, that doesn't work either, because nature didn't put people in racial categories. It put the human genome in a form that I think Professor Jeffrey Long did a spectacular job in finally visualizing for anybody who was interested. It turned out there weren't a lot of people who were interested, but this is, you know what, this is counterintuitive in the way of, I remember poor Galileo, he didn't end up too well because, you know, he's talking about, well, the earth was revolving around the sun, but everybody knew he was crazy because you could see the sun revolving around the earth. Okay, well, this is counterintuitive because what we see is what we refer to as essentialism. There are African genes and there are European genes and Asian genes and, you know, and various mixtures and admixtures and so forth and so on. But what geneticists really haven't been talking about is that they found out that no, that wasn't the case. The 335 million is that big circle that I put Africa under. The groups that we refer to as races are subsets of the basic human genome. And the basic human genome relates to the 335 million genes that are still on the African continent. Now, the reason I say it's counterintuitive is because what we have to understand is the fact that we can all agree, more or less, that we as humans originated in Africa. And when various populations left Africa, over time they would branch off and then branch off again and branch off again and so forth and so on. And next thing we know, we have humans populating the world. But the reality is that the 335 million genes have a lot of copies. And so every time there is a branching off, a certain number of gene variants are lost. I mean, not an incredible amount, but a certain number are lost, so that Africans have the largest number of gene variants. And when anthropologists want to figure out the chronology of various populations who have, migrated to various parts of the world, now what they can do is genomic analysis of gene variants. And the populations with the fewest gene variants will be the population that is the last branch to have migrated out. But I think even more counterintuitive is simply the issue that the presumption was that if you have black skin, you have black gene, gene variants, and white skin, white gene variants. But what is this telling us? It's telling us that the pale skin and the blonde hair and the blue eyes and the epicantic folds in Asians, they're all in the African genome. And the reason humans have survived is because we have a sufficient number that will allow for adaptations to so many different environments when it is required for our survival. One of the issues, apart from the 335 million for which geneticists have really not been able to pin down what they do, it became a issue. The second issue related to essentially what I had referred to essentially in passing, in the sense that this is a perfect example of the fact that the disease triggering variants are population specific. And we only began to see that from about 2008 because of the work of a geneticist, Sarah Tishkoff, who was collecting gene variants from various parts of the world. And she opened a kind of Pandora's box, because you think, oh, something like lactose tolerance, lactase persistence, or lactase non-persistence in terms of being able to drink milk. What she saw was that it's only Northern Europeans who they all are using the LCT gene, but the variant that gives Northern Europeans the ability to process lactase is a variant called 13910TT. In Eastern Europeans and Northern Indians, it's LCT 22018A. And here is the real crux of the matter. The Sudanese and the Kenyans and the Tanzanians are not only on the same continent, but they're next to each other. For one, it's LCT CG 13907, and I mean, you can read the other ones. But the point being that even when they're next to each other, if it's on the African continent, you're going to find so many more gene variants. And we're talking about the exact same medical issue, lactase. And I say this because we have to be aware of the fact that when the media announces a particular breakthrough in cancer because of some genetic research that has been done, we have to be very careful with that, because now it has become very clear that for many, if not most, diseases that have not yet been cured, because 20th century medicine was universal because it cured maybe the simpler diseases in a way. And so now we're left with those cancers that are not curable and those other diseases that we haven't found cures for. And the point of these gene variants is that if we can find the specific gene variant that is causing a disease, then we can turn to the pharmacologist to find a particular biochemical to block it. And that is the basis of precision medicine. And the point is, when it works incredibly well. But it just so happens, sadly, that only 3% of the African genome has ever been sequenced. So who is it going to happen for? Becomes part of the question. Now, in terms of this issue of African history, I would like to mention the fact that the reason I started making connections was because I had spent many years working on manuscripts, particularly from Timbuktu. And one of them is called the Tariq-e-Sudan, the Tariq-e-Sudan. And it helps us to understand parts of African history that Westerners had no knowledge of, because these were areas that were in the Islamic network. And we have these large empires, ancient Ghana, ancient Mali, ancient Songhai. Okay. The basis for the wealth of these enormous, powerful empires, which eventually collapsed, was the trans-Saharan trade, in which gold was traded for salt. But here's the deal. This is the thing that got me going with all of this research that finally related to health. Gold traded for salt. The wealth of these empires was based on the fact that they were getting gold pound for pound for rock salt. The gold was being mined in the interior of West Africa, outside of the boundaries of these powerful states. But then you might ask, why would anybody in their right mind be selling their gold for salt? And the answer was simple. The populations in the interior of West Africa that were outside the boundaries of these huge empires were in the most sodium deficient region of Africa. Those populations lived on 500 milligrams of, on less than 500 milligrams of sodium per day, when medical textbooks say that no human can live on less than 500. But now they're having to correct it, because they're seeing that there are areas in the world, in the Amazon rainforest and so forth, where there are literally saltless societies. Now, when I say saltless, the reality is that all humans need sodium, but salt is the mineral that has a whole lot of sodium. If you have the access to salt, then you're going to be getting thousands of milligrams of sodium. And if you don't have access to salt, you're going to be getting your sodium from various plants and various animals and so forth. So you're going to be getting enough sodium for your body to function. But here's the deal. Remember, now we're understanding gene variants. We're understanding how do certain populations live in certain environments. The West Africans who were selling their gold for salt had certain gene variants of the APOL1 gene. What we're seeing, we're understanding certain things, but the medical community doesn't always make the connections if it doesn't understand them. West Africans from the coast could not live in the interior of West Africa. Why? Because they did not have the G1 and the G2 variants that were so absorbent of sodium that they allowed human populations to live in areas that were completely salt deficient. So here we have manuscripts from medieval Timbuktu talking about the absolute importance of this trade. And then once you ask yourself, well, gee, what was going on there? And it becomes fairly apparent what was going on was a situation in which there was no salt in this area. So when the elites were able to get salt from selling their gold, they would use it as coins. They would use it, you know, for money and so forth. But now here's the deal. The lower echelon population had never tasted table salt. And when the gold ran out, slave traders from the coast took advantage of their vulnerability, living in an environment that was a kind of no man's land, because so-called normal people couldn't even live there because it was so sodium deficient. Well, the point of that is, guess what? 38 million African Americans of slave descent are the descendants of those people. They're not the descendants of West Africans from the coast. They were marched 500 to 1,000 miles and then uploaded onto ships. And as a consequence, what we ended up with was a situation in which 11,000 African Americans are dying of certain kidney diseases, all of which are triggered by sodium consumption. But there's a huge problem. The huge problem is the fact that $100 million at least has been spent on finding a cure for APOL1 mediated kidney disease and all the various diseases related to it, which includes preeclampsia in Black women in childbirth. And in looking for a cure, which they haven't found, they have not done any research whatsoever on the issue of prevention. Prevention being what happens when you translocate a population from 500 or less milligrams of sodium per day that they are completely adapted to, and now they're eating 3,400 to 5,000 milligrams of sodium a day. And there is no scientific research being done because scientists assume that African Americans were from the coast of West Africa, and everybody knows anybody from the coast of anywhere is going to be eating a great deal of sodium. So this is the simple point that comes from having a precision knowledge of history, as opposed to having some general assumption that might actually be very ignorant. And as a consequence, there's just one issue I want to mention in closing as I'm going through these various details, and I really apologize about those wonderful slides. But what has essentially happened was that in the 1980s, an African-American professor, his name was Wilson, Thomas Wilson, he speculated that the reason so many African-Americans were dying from kidney failure was because they were from a low sodium environment. But then there was another historian, Philip Curtin, from a much more prestigious university. He was at Northwestern University. And he said, well, that was ridiculous because there's no sodium problem in Africa, or sodium problem in West Africa. Well, what ended up happening was that the very notion of talking about hypertension, which is high blood pressure, salt-sensitive hypertension, and kidney disease, and people dying of kidney failure as it related to sodium, literally became an urban legend. It's like, oh, we all know that that is not true, but we all know that that is not true because one scholar from a more prestigious university said it was not true. So when you think of 11,000 people a year dying of a disease that in 1986 may have identified a way of preventing future people of dying from it, that is the point that I'm making about the power of history and the power of breaking down barriers, even when our disciplines can be so rigidly defined. But when it comes to this problem of the 330 something gene variants, we can't wait another 50 years or whatever for somebody to, in the medical industry, to say, oh, but we can't figure this thing out. We have to find out what situations there might be in terms of those Americans who are at high risk of certain diseases, and we don't know why. When in fact, the reasons why come from us getting into the etiology of the disease, in the sense that what gene variants do they have that allow them to survive in a very unique environment that have become so maladaptive that it's killing them in the United States. So I think I will essentially leave it at that, because I just feel as though now is the time for us to break down barriers. Thank you.
So we'll take a few questions from the audience. So most of us in this room are in the Intro to Africana Studies course, and we've been reading up on the science and the pseudoscience of race, and been thinking about race as a historical formation that's socially constructed and even performed in everyday life. And what is, I think, interesting about this talk that you've given us is that on the one hand, you agree with this kind of social construction thesis, if you will, but you don't go to the opposite end of the spectrum and saying that, okay, well, we should be hyper skeptical of science.
Yeah.
Right. But actually, we should do it better in some way.
Absolutely. We should do it better, and we should not be intimidated by scientific kind of technological language. Because one of the things I realized when I was working on this is that there's some fundamental issues that nobody knows anything about, and it's not as though it's not in the literature, but it's hidden under all kinds of technical jargon. It's hidden under technical jargon, and you have to kind of unbury it. But if there are issues that are of importance, and you begin to see a link with something that is not your specialty per se, then follow it, then follow it. And honestly, I was really taken aback by how, first, science is wonderful. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be an astronomer, and I love science and so forth and so on. But I'm not intimidated by it. And when there are issues for which it turns out, oh, it looks like the answer might have something to do with genetics, then I can take out some time to learn the basics of genetics. The work I was doing, I come out with an algorithm, but that's third grade arithmetic. Kind of coded over, with all kinds of polished technical terms and things. So, yeah.
So it's a great model, right, for the interdisciplinarity of Black studies, of Africana studies, and even the transdisciplinary, right? So you don't take for granted kind of your own commitments and investment, your training, your intellectual background. You really think about what the problem is, right? And you develop the knowledge, produce the knowledge you need to think it through. So I hope there are tons of questions for our speakers. We've read a number of things. Yep.
Thank you for this talk
Sure.
and for your work. I wanted to ask if you or your team has factored in studies around like trauma. So I'm thinking of like how trauma can also affect, genes, and also the amount of trauma, right, that Black people have experienced throughout time, especially after the transatlantic slave trade. So how that impacts this work.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked, because that is a huge, huge issue. And I feel, especially as a Black person, that we have undergone enormous amounts of stress because of racism. And of course, there is trauma. But I'm a little skeptical of the current meme that everything that ails Black people is caused by stress and racism. And I say that because I've spent too many years as a historian, and I know what trauma kills people. There are ethnic groups that no longer exist, or that have been completely disempowered and depopulated because of certain trauma. But African Americans aren't that group. At the end of the Civil War, there were 800,000 African Americans, the people who were then liberated from slavery. They're now 38 million. And the interesting thing is that after slavery, whites were positive that we were going to die out, because how could we function, without them taking care of us, so to speak, so forth and so on. And I feel as though it's a kind of laziness that has seeped into the social sciences, that rather than looking for clues, it's more comfortable to simply assume that every problem we have is trauma. And there are real problems we have, from poverty and racism and all kinds of horrible things. And I'm not saying that none of that is the case, but when we have researchers saying, I don't want to hear about this, because this takes away from our meme of trauma and stress and racism, that's when I don't like it.
More specifically about the study on the genetics and how they could affect like diseases nowadays, would you say you have like a rough parameter of how much, or like how far back they should be studied, or any sort of like how much they should be studied in specifics?
Oh, okay. If I understand what you're saying, my answer would be, the reason I call the book Ancestral Genomics was because what I realized was that there was a certain knowledge base that went back thousands of years. So it's not like your parents relative to your grandparents and there'll be some kind of total new mutations, because the thing that was so interesting is that when it comes to pathogens, it's like, look at COVID, it's like every couple of days there's a new mutation. But when it comes to what they call gain of function variants, they can go back millions of years. But the point I'm essentially making is that it's not enough to know what someone was doing a generation ago. But if we know what was going on in a community over the course of 1,000 years, over the course of 2,000 years, or over, or even the history a lot of times is about one population having migrated to some other place, and nobody even knows anything, or nobody thinks there's any value in knowing that. But actually, there might be enormous value. Just as with African Americans, if you did not know specifically where they came from and where they had been living for a sufficient time, I don't know, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, so that they would have the G1 and the G2. I'm sorry, I had such a cute picture of them, of these variants, then you wouldn't be able to make the connection. So if that is answering your question, it's not immediate. It's populations that have been sculpted into certain environments, and then they are removed to very different environments. And those populations will never be billions of people, as in the races. It will be well-defined groups of people living in particular ecological environments. Does that answer your question?
I got your slides.
Excuse me.
I got your slides.
Okay, do I have a moment for me to
Just
click, which one? This?
just here.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, this is my final one. And what I'm saying is that, how many of America's, wait, I'm sorry, when I wrote that, it was 37, it's 38. Okay, 38 million Blacks of slave descent were informed that they carry one of the most precious gifts that nature could confer. It was the attunement of their bodies over time to the ecological niche their ancestors had inhabited. This is not a pathology. Everything that is different in Blacks is usually medically defined as a pathology. But these were powerful tools that created survival. And so it's not, these aren't issues that we should be ashamed of if, it turns out that when you go from 500 to 5,000 milligrams, you're going to end up dropping dead from kidney failure. And so this is not a pathology, it's an ancestral gift. And I'll just, if I have like 2 more minutes, I'll send it. Okay, I was just focusing on the salt issue, but the issue of calcium is very, very similar. Okay, I was talking about lactose intolerance. Within the medical community, lactose intolerance is a pathology that needs to be fixed. But as I was showing in the book, if someone of Northern European ancestry is lactose intolerant, that will probably need to be fixed because they will not have the gene variants they have that metabolize calcium is blocking too much calcium. Now, what does it mean? It means that people of Northern European ancestry, they're lactose tolerant, but they have high levels of osteoporosis. If you go to West Africa, where people are 99% lactose intolerant, the doctors, in many cases, have never even heard of osteoporosis. Black people, and so, African Americans are 75% West African, 25% Northern European. So you'll find a few African Americans with osteoporosis, but for the most part, African Americans don't get osteoporosis. They have very strong bones. They have many, many fewer cases of, fractured bones. But the reason this is a very powerful issue for me is simply because if you have a gene variant that is a highly absorbent of calcium, and calcium is a very, very active mineral, what happens when you are therefore translocated to an environment that is a very high calcium dairy environment? Now, even though 75% of African Americans are lactose intolerant, all of us we stay away from milk, but we eat cheese and we eat butter and we eat a whole lot of ice cream and so forth and so on. So it's a high calcium food culture, and we eat a lot more calcium than we need for strong bones. Well, the point I'm getting at is that, just as I mentioned, the $100 million on APOL1, I don't know how many millions of dollars have been spent on a very, very serious problem African American women have. It is a form of breast cancer called triple negative breast cancer. Now, it just so happens that there's a whole lot of medical research on it, but absolutely none of it relates to the particular gene variant that African women have that is highly calcium absorbent, even though a laboratory in identifying triple negative breast cancer identifies it's the gene variant of this TRPV6 gene that begins to proliferate uncontrollably. It's a different disease from what white women get, but if you read every single medical journal article, it's about BRCA. BRCA1 and BRCA2. These are the two genes that trigger breast cancer in other populations. And what has happened is that there's been a tremendous breakthrough, because when you find the variant, then they've been able to block it. But there is no cure for triple negative breast cancer. And I'm sure there's not going to be any anytime soon, because there's absolutely no research on any variants that African Americans have that other Americans don't have. And I think it's going to be the work of you all to, within the various humanities and liberal arts and history and anthropology and so forth, to really insist that the design of medical studies has to take into account the actual precise realities of non-Western populations. As you will know from your college studies, that medical researchers don't have a clue about. But and one last thing, it's one thing not to have a clue, but sometimes there's an arrogance about they don't need to have a clue,
So we're almost out of time, but I think maybe we can take a couple of questions all together, and then that would be so. Let's see, we have one here. There may be one or two others. Just identified. Okay.
Thank you for coming. I was looking forward to this. I wanted to ask you, during the days back when integrity as my professor said, back in the early days of Tom Merritt, did they look into that type of various different types of dis-ease or unease to the body? And was there research even then of how your environment as well as dietary habits were?
Okay, and, yeah, because. Wow, I'm so glad you asked that, because I have a simple answer to to our health. African American health is not good. The simple answer is we have to get back to our ancestral diets, but we have enough food. And I'm sorry about this soul food thing. It's not real. No, what I mean is that the rich, well, I shouldn't say rich diet that slaves were eating, they weren't eating a rich diet, but they were having to grow their own food as slaves, so therefore they were eating the food that was much closer to their ancestral diet. And, I apologize for saying something that is very politically incorrect, sort of, but I'll say it anyhow to this very warm audience, and that is our rate of mortality, was in better shape 2 centuries ago than it is today. But the reason, this is something so amazing to me, the problem started in the 1950s. It started in the 1950s as we were having the beginnings of the civil rights movement and successes, but an acculturation into white mainstream food culture. That is when it started. And I remember talking to a woman once, and it just really clicked. She was talking about different food, and she says, for instance, something like rice. Rice technology was transferred to the United States from the Senegambia in West Africa. West Africans ate rice, they ate millet, they ate sorghum, so forth and so on. But I remember saying, talking about it, and she says, "Oh, rice is po folks' food." And that's when I realized the problem. The grains that our ancestors ate, we don't eat it anymore, or don't, eat it as a staple food. And I realized that I'm going to say this, but it doesn't have anything to do with African Americans, but it tuned me into the real problem. That is, Europeans in colonizing these huge continents with all of this fertile land, they used bioweapons, and the bioweapons to kill off the Native Americans were, measles and that sort of thing. But West African farmers had the same immunities that Europeans had, and they had more immunities because they were also immune to tropical diseases. But the reason I'm mentioning Native Americans is because the other issue is every single indigenous population on this planet has a serious alcohol problem. And I'm talking about Native Americans, the Sami in Scandinavia, the Khoisan people in South Africa. The reason is very simple. Hunter-gatherers are not genetically adapted to grains. And the metabolism of grains in the human body leads to a byproduct, which is alcohol. And so farming populations still have alcohol problems, but from 10% as opposed to 60%. The reality is that human beings are adapted to, and here again, I mentioned our ancestors, because whatever people were doing for 2,000 years or for 1,000 years, even though they're not doing it now, that's what our bodies are adapted to. That's what our bodies are adapted to. So our ancestral diets will tell us a lot of things, but the problem is sorghum, last I heard, they only use it for brooms in America. You know, and it's a very important grain, so.
So I think we're out of time, but join me in thanking Dr. Hilliard for his fantastic talk.